Thank you for having me. Good to be here. So who writes the future? That's a big question. I certainly wouldn't say myself, but I think what I allude to in my presentation is that my writing and related practices are future-oriented. So in thinking about my presentation, I thought it would be best to speak about a recent experience and then reflect on that, as well as reflect on my writing process, and then also allude kind of to an upcoming project that is scheduled for 2021. So earlier this year, I was invited to hold a critical writing workshop at the KZNSA Gallery in Durban. The invitation came about in a roundabout kind of way. Gabi Ngobo, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with, was curating an exhibition titled Mating Birds, Volume 2. The exhibition was her first on home ground, straight after curating the Berlin Biennale, and she invited me down to Durban to conduct this writing workshop as part of the educational program for the exhibition. The exhibition drew on a novel by Louis Ngosi. The novel is set in Durban and was published after the Immorality Acts prohibiting mixed marriages and relationships were repealed. Louis Ngosi's novel, Mating Birds, was first published in 1983, and it explores the enduring pathology of racism and the devastation it wrought on individual lives. So essentially, Gabi's exhibition, Mating Birds, Volume 2, drew on this and was about representing, through a montage of place, public memory, and the archive, a space of encounter between pernicious apartheid laws and the small, singular events at the intersection with unjust and repressive laws. In thinking about the content and the format of the critical writing workshop would take, I settled on sharing with my participants the transcript of a speech from Patricia McFadden. Patricia gave a speech at the University of Pretoria on thought leadership. Her speech was titled African Thought Leadership, Writing as and for Resistance. In it, McFadden speaks about two features of writing. First, writing as process, and writing as being. She breaks down how these two processes offer a methodology towards writing as a revolutionary choice and a revolutionary practice. Of particular interest to me are McFadden's thoughts on writing as being. She positions writing as being as an embodied expression premised on attachments and as occupying a space in resistance to unequal and exploitative systems and practices. For example, writing and speaking against normativity requires that, in her words, I insist upon my individuality, my peculiarities as a female intellectual African writer, etc. For her, this insistence becomes writing as resistance in its positioning against patriarchal claims that subjugate women to sexual, domestic, and cultural impunity and gendered normativity. The moment of this workshop and its formulation became one of self-reflection on my own practice of writing, and to consider what it is really that I'm doing with my writing and my related practices. So, as I mentioned, I do feel my practice is future-oriented, and what this means is this future-oriented positionality is prompted by both feminist and post-colonial revisions of knowledge to raise a number of questions concerning Black women's historiographies, their representations, primarily in aesthetic and experimental ways within an expanded field of reference that is artistic practice. This means approaching writing as a method of inquiry in which my stance and voice as a researcher do not pretend to be neutral and objective, but are attached to my peculiarities and subjectivity and therefore perform a kind of advocating role. there can be, for me, no other way of writing when we consider that Black female practices in the arts are fundamentally embedded in a context that has challenged their very rights to exist. And the resulting economy of lack of Black women in art historical canons. The contradiction of addressing the question of Black women and their attended absences falsifies the nature of the issue and tacitly kind of reinforces negative stereotypes, presenting themselves as simple reflections on reality, when in fact they are ideologically and culturally constructed. For example, the absence of recognition of and for the work of Black women artists is actually a problem of having to work in stultifying, oppressive, and deeply disturbing environments in which the life experiences and traditions of Black producers in general are given no relevance in implicitly racist environments. So given this backdrop, how do the knowledges that we center and then inform our theorizing and doing as Black women in this environment? In the face of these and other absences of Black women, feminist, womanist, and decolonial efforts are performed to fill the apparent voids, and attempts that dig up examples worthy of insufficiently appreciated women artists throughout history and rediscover their forgotten voices are essentially to perform a flawed exercise. But from my position, flawed as this exercise might be, it is still worthwhile, since these efforts seemingly have done nothing to question the assumptions lying behind the present obscurity and continued historical and institutional omissions of Black women. As a kind of a personal resolve and focusing on womanist, feminist, and indigenous studies as a conceptual framework that are theoretically aligned to African womanism and existential phenomenology, I have considered how the ideas and production of women who have been silenced may be reclaimed in ways that shift the assumptions of how we come to know and how the knowledge is shaped. Making this move means exposing the fragility of knowledge assembly. This involves questions of ethics, the ethics involved in modes of telling, the sensory and effective responses to the material production of research, and the forms of violence committed in the narrating of stories of absent others. This requires a responsive methodology that questions what is known and opening up ongoing questions that unsettle assumptive modalities involved in research and writing practices. That means writing can therefore become commensurable with ethical action, and the temporal relationship between ethics and epistemology can be closed. For me, one of the crucial texts has been Cynthia Dillard's well-cited The Substance of Things Hoped For, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, Examining an Endarkened Feminist Epistemology in Education, Research, and Leadership, in which she lays out how feminists of color have chosen to construct a theory as political agenda for achieving social justice rather than only to engage in intellectual debates that deconstruct existing paradigms. As a framework, endarkened feminist epistemology theorizes a social science that refuses to sidestep African women's perspective. As a corrective to conceptual quantifying of Black, this includes African and African diasporic feminist thought, Dillard offers a framework that helps to legitimize the languages, discourses, challenges, unique perspectives, divergent experiences, and intersecting oppressions and places and privileges the African women's and girls' lives. Since I am not interested in debunking and deconstructing existing paradigms, how then do I put myself in my own text, and with what consequences? Here I would like to speak about a project that Nontobeko Ntombela and I are embarking on, and its framing touches on some of what I've said above in terms of the feminist accounts of excluded voices as essentially flawed, but how this becomes maybe rescued by Dillard's theorizing about the need not to deconstruct existing paradigms, but actually to work on the construction of an alternative historiography of practices. To introduce Nontobeko is a researcher and art historian based at the Art History Department at WITS. In 2012, Nontobeko restaged Gladys Mgudlandu's first commercial exhibition at the Contact magazine boardroom in Cape Town. The exhibition happened in 1961. Nontobeko drew on curatorial and exhibition practices to navigate the archive of Mgudlandu's practice. And she drew on the public acclaim that Gladys experienced at the time, and then also reflected on the lack of positioning within her lack of positioning within the historical canon of South African art. So beside the use of art historical provenance to recuperate details of the work of the original exhibition, her effort involved locating unrecognized and unheralded works, scattered and long out of circulation, of two women painters. So Valerie Desdemore, who practiced at the same time that Gladys Mgudlandu practiced. And so she questioned how, out of all the other people who were practicing at this time, they had managed to have their ideas and production preserved, but yet their absence in the history of South African art bears the contradictions of a canon that relegates their production to the margin. This forthcoming project with Nonto is then entitled Black Women and the Painterly Tradition, and is a gesture towards exploring and theorizing aesthetic questions from the Black female vantage point. This is to contest the fact that presently, other than the research previously done by Nonto, there is not a single volume that is dedicated to the painterly contributions of Black women in South Africa. The research is about inclusion and representation and creating a historiography of painterly traditions of modernist and current Black women painters. It is of epistemic importance in terms of reworking the past and focusing efforts to unveil repressed histories in ways that are both critical and formally experimental. And the idea for us is that it will help us to understand the South African Black women's subjectivities and forms of agency in cultural practice, and then to also center their futurity. The consideration to work within the expanded field of painting is because South African art history and its contemporary practices in paintings are disproportionately biased towards white men, white women, and Black men, making it appear as though Black South African women have made no contribution towards the material expansion of painting as a genre. So what Nonto and I are trying to find out, one, is why are these biographies and accounts in and of themselves persistently escape the art historical landscape? And so the crucial part of the question with the project is asking, what is it that maintains their marginal positionality? We regard this project as one of political importance, as a work of transmission that speaks through historical narrative to tenderly evoke its new historical figures and position, and then to position current practitioners within a historically grounded continuum. So by way of concluding, I would say, how do we nurture our individuality and at the same time lay claim to knowing something? So my engagement with feminist methodological strategies in the above described and other projects specifically involved working with intersecting feminist postcolonial critiques and approaches that begin to call to attention to the ways in which erasures can occur to the specificities of subjects and their particular bodies. I would like to draw again from Patricia McFadden, who correctly points out that in all instances, it is the male writer who is projected into the future as knowing. And males are quintessentially positioned as the expression of where theory lies. Women generally, and women who write in particular, are largely relegated to the margin of writing, textuality, narration, knowledge creation, and retrieval. So by understanding that if research and writing remains in their present and historical masculinist hegemonic thinking space, we will not see or be enriched by the various communities that make up the diversity of worldviews. My current realization is that it is by drinking from our own wells and making references to the research that exists that speaks to the experiences of Black women and asserting the validity of our own ways of knowing and being in resistance to the intensifying hegemony of mainstream epistemology, one can then begin to draw on new references to positively construct new narratives. This means as long as we are not dictating the questions and how the question is to be written and responded to, we will remain within this economy of lack brought on by Anglo-European cosmology and epistemologies that refuse to expand and accommodate other worldviews and other knowledges and other ways of knowing. So, thanks.